Hello everyone, my name's Shahid Nazir Mohammed. I'm going to do a brief overview of this poster presentation that I am honored to have had accepted for the 53rd annual European Society of Pediatric Nephrology conference that's taking place in Amsterdam this year in 2021. This is one of two poster presentations. This one is on using social media, mainstream media, to promote organ donation and transplantation, and education, ethics from a healthcare science and educational stance. Basically, first and foremost, I have to apologize to audience members who are not familiar with areas around organ donation and transplantation. In itself, the topic is quite intricate, and it is also quite carries over into various perspectives where healthcare is concerned, and also where research is concerned. And also apologies for the fact that this poster presentation is quite wordy, but I'm going to give a breakdown of what this work has been about, and feel free to listen to this overview at your own leisure, and you can find out more about this work should you want to do that. In as an overview, this work has had several aims and objectives. There were three questions being proposed here. Can Muslims, and basically this work is coming from a perspective where faith, ethics, and science kind of join together, and looking at those entities, or those entities in conjunction with a long-term condition perspective, and that is chronic kidney disease, and the three questions that are being proposed is, can Muslims donate their organs? Number one, is there, and number two is there an Islamic stance on using social media or mainstream media to promote organ donation, transplantation, and education? And number three, does the healthcare scientist have a role providing the public education surrounding organ donation and transplantation? And to answer these questions, the long-term condition chronic kidney disease will be used to provide an example. That's the aims and objectives, and this work looks the focuses on there's the entity around a bit of understanding around what chronic kidney disease is. Then there's which forms the main focus, and then there is prior to that there's the focus around social media, mainstream media, and health education. There is also the entity around faith, ethics, and science, and ethics from a healthcare science educational stance, and some points around in discussion and conclusion. First off, really more than everything, is that with exception to individuals with severe learning difficulties and neurological illnesses, which of course are devastating in their own right, there has never been there's never existed a human being with who has not been aware of not only of his or her body, but of his his body, but also of his or her individuality, but both physical both physical and spiritual. And that's been documented by research going back to 1998. 1998 by a researcher named Mouse. And human beings are consciously aware of their own lives, and it's through understanding that awareness of a consciously constructed self is actually identified, and that's been highlighted by research in 1998 by an author called Dunn. The use of social media today provides sort of unparalleled opportunity to provide an understanding, information and understanding around different areas of healthcare, education, and access to communication, and engagement, and thus allows opportunity to be more interactive. So, and through social media or mainstream media, such as television, newspapers, magazines, radio stations, these are all other outlets that are being used to prompt education surrounding different entities, or whatever that might be, and then that is included around different long-term conditions, but some more than others. For example, more so in the media, in generic context is, for example, things around cancer, and maybe heart disease or heart conditions. These forms of the forms of education that come out have not been totally explored in detail, or at least in context with organ donation and transplantation, and so therein there is a gap, or if not a gap, it's an area that is very sensitive, and quite rightly so, but also where different, because we live in a diverse world or diverse society, everyone has their own take on and perspective on not just individuality, but obviously the way that individuals interact or engage with different forms of media can actually help inform or disinform or discourage decision making, and certainly the use of social media is not limited by constraints of time and geography, and that's I'm sure everyone is aware of that, and Eisenbach into the 2001 highlighted that, at least from an early perspective, where the not just around aspects around social media, but also around how the World Wide Web has been used in its early time, social media and mainstream media, and where health education is specifically, a study conducted on college students in the US demonstrated that social based communication had the greatest impact for donor registration, and described that a social media campaign used Facebook and YouTube resulted in 9,000 documented donor registrations. Within the student organization, the organ donation registration was increased by nearly 30%, and that was a paper that's been highlighted by in work highlighted by Desandro in 2000 and his colleagues in 2012. And furthermore, whilst traditional online in line with that, obviously, and how media has been used, that also would have been accompanied with different forms of advertising, for example, and advertising offers the opportunity to promote where there's sensitive topics or areas where though there's a diverse though we will live in a diverse world of there's diverse populations, and there's sensitivities and different perceptions about how these topics are received. There is this team identified that with advertising that offers the opportunities for different messages and exposure when combined with the use of social networking sites, or social media, and the mainstream media, that links that helps link areas around organ donation or transplantation, and it resulted in an increase in a request for organ donation cards, for example, as well, and that's also linked to more prospective work by Mohammed et al. In 2015. The use of social media alongside existing media and resources can be seen to be highly effective in promoting organ donation or transplantation. One long-term and obviously in this context, one long-term condition that surrounds organ donation and transplantation quite heavily is actually chronic kidney disease. Just a bit understanding around that. But before we get into that, I will talk a little bit about. Actually, no, I think it's right to highlight a bit about the chronic kidney disease perspective first, and then talk a little bit about faith, the faith perspective and ethics and science, and how they kind of mesh or join. Again, with the poster presentation, I apologize that it feels a bit quite wordy, and actually the way that you review or look at the poster presentation yourselves, if you get time, then you can actually review it, look over it in a way that's comfortable for yourselves. In that way, it's open to interpretation. Just a brief understanding on chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease is basically a long-term, irreversible clinical condition and has been described as the gradual and usually permanent loss of kidney function over time. The word chronic means over months or years versus acute, which is weeks, days or weeks. In this context, loss of kidney function is where chronic is where there's a renal function or kidney functional damage over time. Early in the disease process, individuals with CKD often experience no symptoms, and for a long time it has been an underdiagnosed condition. That's not new understanding. There's various papers out there that highlight that understanding. There's work by a renowned author, Stuart Cameron, who was a renowned author around and physician around nephrology, and in 2013 he highlights that context, or that context has been cited from that perspective, from his works, and even in the absence of symptoms, CKD appears to add significantly to the burden of cardiovascular disease, or CVD, and death. The rate of CKD has been increasing worldwide, and this is leading to a greater need for kidney transplantation. And again, that's not new understanding. That's been documented in various by various authors, not least by Stefanon in 2012. And transplantation is not a cure. It's a form of replacement therapy in essence, and however it has been deemed as a cost-effective a metric, really, in that context, in comparison to the other forms of renal replacement therapy or kidney replacement therapy, such as peritoneal dialysis or hemodialysis, in the treatment of this long-term condition, and ultimately achieves a higher prognosis, more morality, and that is also not unfamiliar understanding, and has been documented in works by Stuart Cameron, and others. Currently living with living with kidney with the long-term condition accounts for 1/3 of currently living with kidney donation accounts for 1/3 of kidney transplants performed in the UK, at least, and that percentage, or that understanding, or that percentage would differ, depending on demographic and where kidney transplants are performed, depending on where individuals who need them are in the world, and the in that context, the most common access has been a mixture, actually, between cadaveric versus live donors, live transplantation, and but there has been a mix in relating to which way of accessing donors is higher. But in that context, there is this high need but low supply among minority ethnic populations presents problems in achieving an original a match of blood group and tissue type, where there are less common among the majority population, resulting in patients from minority ethnic groups, including those who follow specific faiths, and in this context, from an Islamic faith or a Muslim faith, spending an increased time on the transplantation waiting list, and that's documented in works by Stefanon 2012, Mohammed et al. 2015, and Sissons in 2011. That notwithstanding, it must be highlighted here that there is a mix where ultimately those who are from BAME backgrounds, they can be waiting on the organ donation or transplantation list longer, and that's a given. But delving in deeper, there is research still, though there is some research out there, it does not has not focused entirely specifically on those who are from BAME backgrounds and follow a specific faith, or from a specific faith. So the debate can be had quite easily on this, to say that what, for example, why should we look at those from specifically one faith versus another, and that question has been partly will be partly answered through this poster presentation. Moving on really now to the aspects around faith, ethics and science. Islamic science has always been holistic. This term, in which is one of the of recent origin, is a little bit ambiguous. Sometimes it refers only to the recognition of interdependence between mind and body, and that's been highlighted by several authors, including Rispler in 2007, Ghali in 2008, and Sheikh in 2007, and others as well, including Rocklinsberg, who in 2008, in 2009, these authors are renowned authors in aspects of faith, ethics, and science. Well, more around faith and ethics than science. Although one can quite easily highlight that when they talk when literature is composed or understood from these from where ethics and faith is concerned, then ultimately that does embody or it does embody or emboss around aspects of science. If theory relates to holism or holism, i.e., where things are holistic, then with reference to the Islamic perspective, then really it can only refer to the governing principle of Islam. So where this is concerned is basically Tawheed, and when we're looking at when those who follow that particular faith, or when looking at holism or holisticness, for those who follow that faith, there is in reference there is Tawheed, which basically means oneness. When they pray, or not when they pray, although prayer is part and parcel of what their focus is around. They actually pretty much everything that they do throughout their routines day to day embodies Tawheed, and that is belief. That is their link in the where there is there is integration around their mind, body, and soul, really, around the oneness, in oneness of the Creator, and in that context, their Creator is called they refer to the Creator as where Christians or not even non-Christians would refer to a Creator as God. From an Islamic faith or Muslim faith, the oneness or Tawheed, they refer to God as Allah, and the unity of that He has is created. So the oneness or Tawheed links to unity. And again, that's been highlighted by the same several authors. It is through in this context as well. Then I just want to touch a little bit on aspects of trials and tribulations, because that is actually where the science kind of meshes a bit more, or stands out a bit more in some contexts with relating to the faith and ethics. And so it is through trials and tribulations that man or mankind matures. There is maturity that comes out from those from trials and trials and tribulations, and in that context, when going through when anyone goes through trials and tribulations, in essence, begin to face the reality of a set of circumstances. Trials and tribulations free mankind from the illusions in which man seeks refuge, and that really is a difference between those, in essence, the difference between not just going through trials and tribulations, but the difference between understanding self versus and Tawheed, where there's a link with Tawheed, and actually a linking and a link with where someone might be would be in illusion, having illusions, and the trials So any attempt to study phenomena, i.e. in this context organ donation or transplantation, without reference to scripture in this context, again, where Islam is concerned or Muslims are concerned, they refer to their holy scripture, their scripture, which is the Quran, and that is without reference to that, they or even without generally trying to understand ethics elements around or focus around faith, ethics, and science, is actually destined to failure, because it is fragmented, and fragmented and actually has a several link with reality. So it is also quintessential, really, to note that because religious morality sets limits, do not change truth, then man is also denying that God or Allah, that Allah is a self-evident truth. Science on its own as well has limitations. It is time bound and not timeless, and thus for the Muslim or those who follow that faith, the Quran is in the Arabic word, is the Furqan, is the criterion. So that is the Furqan, and is it teaches the Quran in a robust or overview way. It does actually teach Muslims or those who are following that faith to differences between obviously not just right and wrong, but teaching to also discriminate not only between a good and evil, but also shades of grey, the misnomers which are apparent in daily life as well. And so and it's through that link, Muslims or those following that faith are able to basically it helps them inform aspects of different decisions, different decisions that they have to make in aspects around their daily life, and the Quran is multi-layered, is multifaceted, and it is distinct, and it is and always has been for Muslims throughout history, a premise, again, really for decision making. So that context, I hope, gives a bit of understanding around the link between faith, ethics, and the science context. Now, just that in line with that, really, is the link then around mainstream media, and social media and mainstream media, really, and so from an ethics and educational stance, I've touched on a bit around that. Overall, a greater education of social media on individuals where sharing experience is involved, it is out there or is involved, then that context or that understanding is always going to be open to interpretation, because there may or may not be a scientific basis, or there would be a science basis around that, around certain aspects of what's being, for example, portrayed or highlighted. There may be actual statistics and evidence around that, but for those who are from that faith, or practice that faith, for example, they will inevitably refer back to their understanding around what the faith teaches them, or provides them. Certainly, social media applications have place, and it's important that such topics are discussed to embrace, or to encompass the Muslim faith. In Islam, organ donation, transplantation is first of all, again, it is a sensitive topic, but it is allowed based on evidences that are weighed up in line with scripture. Now that is an area, I have to say outright, I'm not an expert, and I don't claim to be an expert around that, but it is an area that there is understanding around, and what we can say, or what has been said, is that that in Islam, organ donation and transplantation is allowed, as God, or Allah, informs that for every disease there is a cure, and though we those who are for example, are healthcare experts and healthcare specialists, healthcare providers, clinicians, and scientists themselves, for example, generally speaking, there is this understanding that and obviously, of course, patients themselves as well will see that that chronic kidney disease, for example, is not just a long-term condition and irreversible and silent, and a quite an isolated condition in its own right, that there is no cure for that, and as mentioned, whether on different forms of kidney replacement therapy, or renal replacement therapy, peritoneal dialysis, or hemodialysis, or even having a transplant, or kidney transplant, or renal transplant. These are forms of replacement therapy. They are not a cure, but at the same time, when linking aspects of faith, or having that understanding, or knowledge based, or even skill based, to actually integrate aspects of faith, then actually for those individuals, it is a cure, because much like life, generally, we know that life is temporary, and much like that temporariness where life is concerned, and this is understanding or context that is irrespective of going through, irrespective of if one is going through a long-term condition, a terminal illness, or any other health ailment, versus being free from ill health, for example. Then irrespective of whichever way that understanding is perceived, life is temporary, and is short in that context. If that is understood and actually harnessed or in place, then basically in that context, the one should also understand and take into focus and appreciation, really, that in where renal transplantation or forms of renal replacement therapy, they are actually a cure for much like life. They are temporary, so in that context they match, they are a like for like or match for match. So that is the link, that transplantation is temporary, and it is a cure, given that the understanding should be that life is temporary as well. So that should, that again is important to get that understanding. And then really I want to highlight on coming back to the main questions and how and answering them, really. And prior to that, I just want to highlight that clarity of terminology to help increase health literacy on topics relating to organ donation and transplantation is now especially required, owing to more time being spent online. And that's relatable context by authors, not being in 2018, O'Kane in 2015, and Prothero in retrospectively in 2009. Using social media versus mainstream media, and how if not just interacting with those sources of media, it's also to say that using how understanding is perceived on different areas of health, and using social media versus mainstream media to provide wider education surrounding these sensitive topics is still actually quite unique. And however, healthcare, coming back to one of the questions that was asked, and does the healthcare scientist have a role in providing the public education surrounding organ donation and transplantation? Well, in this context, healthcare scientists could seek wider opportunity to provide education surrounding this sensitive topic in this faith population. And what is important to understand here is that much like those who have contributed in authorship and to the body of knowledge from their context, there's a mix of, for example, those who might be, for example, Muslim, and those who, for example, are non-Muslim. So much like that, then those who contribute to that understanding actually is it's very important actually that understanding is contributable from various perspectives, and it does bring about joined up understanding, although there would be differences, and maybe differences of opinions, but that is actually what brings or helps contextualize understanding around this sort of unique topic, and of course sensitive subject. So the questions that were asked again: can Muslims donate their organs? Well, yes, Muslims can donate their organs, whilst there are some perceptions on organ donation and transplantation where Muslims can't donate. These do not represent the wider Islamic world. A campaign providing the need for increased blood and organ donation from BAME backgrounds, or Black and Asian minority ethnicities and Muslim faith, was published by Mohammed et al. Mohammed and colleagues in 2015, and there's no one faith that can claim privilege status regarding the complex and challenging questions of organ donation and transplantation, and that's been highlighted again by several authors. Just to highlight on that, it's very important that perspective comes from various faiths. This work specifically is coming from one particular faith, and because to that faith, in that faith, it is still if not just a sensitive topic, it's how that understanding is perceived through different forms of media, if it comes through media at all. And so there is no one faith that can claim privilege on the rights of status regarding the complexity and challenging questions of organ donation and transplantation. Number two, is there an Islamic stance on using social media, mainstream media, to prompt organ donation and transplantation education? Well, the Islamic stance is on the use of either social media or through mainstream media would be positive to prompt organ donation and transplantation if this helps to increase life expectancy. If policy makers, and I use that word quite loosely because actually wherever there's evidence and there's a link to scripture, really that's the most important driver for those making decisions, at least from this particular faith. But if policy makers want to see an increase in organ donation and transplantation from that faith, for example, then from that faith, then there has to be a more inclusive process. NHS trusts, for example, and I'm giving this perspective from a UK perspective, that NHS trusts in different regions of the UK, our national health services around the different regions in the UK need to not just have a more inclusive processes, but to involve Muslims to help inform areas of practice, and that's been highlighted by several authors Sheikh in 2007, Morgan and colleagues in 2013, and again Mohammed and colleagues in 2015. Specifically, there needs to be further cohesion between producing policy and Muslim involvement more generally. Number three, the question was, does the healthcare scientist have a role? Well, I've touched on some of the answers around that in part of the discussion, but the answer again is yes. However, more research is required to shed light on what is the most effective approach for the healthcare scientists to become proactive surrounding education for Muslim patients, and obviously that should be extended to other health professionals as well, making that more diverse and involved and inclusive. The proliferation and wide usage of social media and mainstream media for education surrounding different long-term conditions over the last decade has also created opportunities for healthcare scientists to seek opportunity to contribute and inform practice, albeit those scientists, traditionally speaking, at least from a healthcare perspective, are scientists who are behind the scenes, normally doing the tests and investigations, for example. But and that is the context in which I provide this this poster presentation, but also to focus on the fact that given that they do those tests investigations as well behind the scenes, for example, again, at least where organ donation and transplantation tests and investigations are concerned for for example, cross-matching and tissue typing, ABO blood grouping, and those kinds of those specific tests that are preempt the process to organ donation and transplantation, then they are actually the types of health professionals, or the kinds of health professionals who automatically have underpinning understanding around this sensitive topic, and so though they might be behind the scenes, having that understanding behind the scenes and bringing that out into the forefront, that is perhaps one of the ways that such scientists, such groups of health professionals, for example, should or could envisage roles of function, really, more from an educational perspective, of course, on the front line, and how that understanding could be documented into the patient records once that understanding is given. So I want to say a huge thank you again to the Scientific and Organising Committee for the European Society of Paediatric Nephrology for allowing me the opportunity to present this poster presentation, and I again look forward to having any potential further follow-up if there is, and feel free to check out the works on the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG. I thank my colleagues the renal patient support group, for allowing me the opportunity to highlight this context as well. Thank you for your time.